everyone, live at 5. And let me tell you something. I wanted to jump for joy when I saw Peta Credlin, an amazing woman, I think 17 years in politics, absolutely grill dictator, liar, comrade Dan, and ask him for some accountability. Now, I want you to watch her entire dissertation that she did, or a monologue. It is eye-opening, and you've got to share this. And I don't normally do this, but here's what happened. Apparently, one of my friends, James McPherson, brilliant columnist, The Good Source, go and follow James, said this, that the scandal is not that 800 people in Melbourne died. The up in arms is not that the hotel quarantine of dictator Dan didn't work, while no one knows, of course, who authorized the payments of millions of dollars to a security company. The real crime is that Peta Credlin dared to ask Dan Andrews questions. Watch this. And then Twitter went into an absolute meltdown because one reporter said, and let me just get her name so we got her name right. One reporter said that Peta Credlin is not an accredited journalist and should have been thrown out of Dan Andrews' press conference. This was by Louise Gill, whose comment received thousands of likes. Watch this. Apparently, our elected officials can only be questioned by the state-sanctioned journalists, by which Twitter most presumably means the socialists or the lefties. Andrews has been covering himself with these lefty socialist reporters who don't ask him questions. And let me tell you, I believe that parliamentary inquiry was a farce. The questions asked were lame and weak. Why is someone like Peta Credlin being maligned on Twitter by these lefties? It seems that they're more interested in backing a guy who is literally overseeing the death of 800 Australians. Now, I want to play this entirety of her segment. Please watch it. Please watch it. And then I'd like you to share it. You see, Peta Credlin showed up at a press briefing with real questions. The questions that we're all asking. Dan Andrews, your government is coming undone. Actually, you are coming undone. What you do in secret will be shouted from the rooftop. Watch this. I know it's going to absolutely open your eyes.
But first, tonight there are further serious questions facing the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, his ministers, and the inquiry into hotel quarantine. At the heart of it, I believe there has been an attempt to cover up the truth in relation to the fateful decision to use private security instead of police and Defence Force personnel to guard Melbourne's quarantine hotels that the Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, confirmed in his media press conference again today, directly led to Victoria's second wave, and as proven by genomic testing, the deaths of almost 800 Victorians. Earlier today, all the various parties who were represented at the hotel quarantine inquiry, chaired, as you know, by Justice Jennifer Coate, well, they finalised their closing submissions. And that material was all made public before 9 a.m. up on the inquiry's official website. There's a lot of evidence provided today, much of it centring around arguments to support or rebut the idea put forward in this inquiry that no person or persons made the fateful decision to use private security, that instead it was just a creeping assumption. If you've watched this program over recent weeks, you will know that I reject absolutely any claim of a creeping assumption. In my experience, 16 years in politics, this is not how government works. And it's not borne out by the facts either. Indeed, it's not borne out by evidence of key players, the elected politicians and the bureaucrats involved in the creation and management of Victoria's hotel quarantine. More than that, though, tonight, I believe in examining evidence today that there's a clear link between the Premier's private office and the Premier's department related to the decision to use private security. That this link has been poorly examined to date by the Coate inquiry, and that indeed the importance of this link has only really become apparent as more and more was known of the critical time frame from when National Cabinet concluded its meeting at around 1 o'clock on Friday the 27th of March, and when the Premier later got to his feet at 3:15 and announced that Victoria would use private security in its hotel quarantine arrangements.
We've got about between 1,300 and 2,000 people arriving back in Melbourne each day. Those numbers perhaps will drop off in coming days, but we have sufficient capacity and we've done the work early to be able to accommodate those people. They will be housed, they will be fed, they will be transported. There'll be no cost to them, but this is the best way to ensure absolute compliance. Police, private security, all of our health team will be able to monitor compliance in a much easier way in a static location, one hotel or a series of hotels as the case may be. That'll mean, and this is the really important message, that will mean that more of those police that we have, those 500 police that are doing that work in terms of coronavirus enforcement, they'll be able to get to even more homes where people are supposed to be quarantining.
I'd like to carefully now step you through much of today's evidence in these closing submissions. And at the end of tonight, you be the judge. First, let's start with the submission today to the Coat Inquiry's closing submission process from the Victoria Police. This submission from Victoria Police also, I must say, incorporates the submission of former Chief Commissioner of Police Graham Ashton. At the very outset, Victoria Police, in this submission, reject any argument put forward that there was a creeping assumption that private security would be used in Melbourne's quarantine hotels. Indeed, Victoria Police very specifically say, on the available evidence, the board should conclude that a decision was made to engage private security. And that, in the view of Victoria Police, and I quote, that decision was made before the 4:30 p.m. State Control Centre meeting on March 27. Indeed, the Victoria Police submission says that it is likely the decision was made even before the 2 p.m. meeting between the Minister, Lisa Neville, Minister for Police, the Commissioner, Crisp, and Mr Ashton. That this was a decision, not a creeping assumption, is further restated at paragraph 18. And again, I quote, for reasons given, a decision was made to engage private security. I might add, I've not underlined that word was made. That was in the police own submission. But here, Victoria Police go even further in today's submission to closing arguments in the Coat Inquiry. At paragraph 31, Victoria Police says, and I quote again, it is evident that between 1:16 p.m. and 1:22 p.m, someone has given information to CCP, Chief Commissioner of Police Ashton, of arrangements to use private security, although he could not recall who gave him that information or advice. This is, as you know, the fateful 6-minute period where Graham Ashton goes from asking questions about the arrangements to use his Victoria Police officers to secure quarantine hotels. The decision we know was taken at National Cabinet, also including the AFP, and was the practice, let's not forget, of every other state other than Victoria, to where he ended up, not so long later, 1:22, being very clear in his mind that private security, not Victoria Police, would be used. Here are the relevant text messages sent from Ashton's phone that bookend this critical 6-minute window. The first message from Ashton to his Federal Police counterpart Reece Kershaw, well, that queried why the AFP weren't guarding hotels at 1:12 p.m. Now, there was no response to this text before Ashton then sent off another text, this time to the head of the Premier's own department, Mr Chris Eccles, where Ashton expressed his concern that Victoria Police could be used to guard these quarantine hotels. Now, between this text from Ashton to Eccles at 1:16 p.m, and then another response from Ashton to Kershaw at 1:22 p.m, we have this crucial 6-minute period where clearly a decision was taken. And we know that it was a decision that absolutely satisfied the police chief, because at 1:22 he sent this text to Kershaw. Now, importantly, in today's submission from Victoria Police, they make it very clear in black and white that they have done their very best to provide every phone record they can from Graham Ashton's phone on this day when the decision to use private security and not Victoria Police was made. They say, and I say again, you've heard me, this was a decision made not to use Victoria Police. It was a decision made to use instead private security. It was not a creeping assumption. Victoria Police's submission today also makes it plain that under the law, they cannot access the full phone records of Graham Ashton. So the record of who called Graham Ashton in that critical 6-minute window, because the inquiry doesn't have powers under Victoria's Inquiry Act, nor can it access Commonwealth-level telecommunications interception powers, that critical window is unknown to Victoria Police other than the outgoing calls of Graham Ashton. Now, there's doubt here. There's doubt. What happened in that 6-minute period? This is not a creeping assumption. And we know at 1:22, Ashton tells his federal police counterpart that Victoria Police will not be running hotel quarantine, that instead Victoria Police will use private security. You heard a little bit before there, didn't you? That was the Premier at 3:15 saying that there would be private security. And we know that was very different from the National Cabinet decision, which National Cabinet broke up at 1 o'clock. And we know it was different because after Kershaw got that text from Ashton saying different rules in Victoria, it will not be Victoria Police, well, Kershaw, the head of the AFP, he responds back to Ashton saying, okay, well, that's new. And this is really important because Ashton then goes back to Kershaw at 1:32 p.m. and says, yep, that's the deal set up by our DPC, Department of Premier and Cabinet. Now let's put that to one side for a moment. What we have is a decision to use private security instead of Victoria Police or the Defence Force, clearly made in that 6-minute window. So who made it? In their closing submission today, the Department of Premier and Cabinet said at paragraph 9 that DPC and Eccles were not involved in the decision to use private security. Now here is what I believe is critically important and that until now, until tonight, has received very little scrutiny. At paragraph 34 of the Victoria Police closing submission, it says this, that at 1:19 p.m, so inside this critical 6-minute window where Ashton goes from being uptight about the use of Victoria Police officers as hotel guards to telling his federal counterpart, it won't be us, it'll be private security, and that indeed it's a special deal, he says, set up by DPC, is this evidence in the Victorian Police submission today. And it says, quote, at 1:19 p.m, a staff member from the Premier's private office sent a text message to Mr. Ada, Deputy Secretary of DPC, referring to security. Now this is a clear connection in the critical 6-minute period between the Premier's private office and the Premier's department. And it marries up with Ashton's text, doesn't it? A few minutes later, heard me say that before to Kershaw, to the AFP in Canberra, that there's a special deal, he said, with our Premier's department, the private security will be used. Now again, the Premier's department repeats today in their submission that they, DPC and Eccles, were not involved in the decision to use private security. So this can only lead to the very clear conclusion, backed up by this 1:19 p.m. text message from the Premier's private office, that his office, his senior staff or him directly made the fateful decision to put private security in charge of Victoria's hotel quarantine program. So this can only lead to the very conclusion that it was the Premier or his chief of staff or another staff member there. Now, we don't know the name of the staff member inside the Premier's private office on that 1:19 p.m. text message because her name or his name has been redacted from the evidence. But to my mind, this could very well be a smoking gun. And tomorrow, let me tell you, there will be very serious questions for the Premier, his office, and indeed the very conduct of this inquiry. Today too, former Health Minister Jenny Mikakos, she made her own closing submission to the inquiry. She rejected the idea of a creeping assumption. She rejected the idea that there was a creeping assumption. She said that there was a decision, a clear decision in relation to private security use. She dealt with much of the conflicting evidence around the request of and later rejection by Victoria of 850 Defence Force personnel. She also accused the Premier of destroying proper cabinet decision-making. Even though the Victorian Liberal opposition has asked Justice Coate to recall Mikakos and the Premier to deal with this conflict or apparent conflict in their evidence, this has been rejected. Surely now it must occur. Today I asked the Premier why he has not provided his full phone records, or indeed any phone records. Nor has Mr Chris Eccles, the head of the Premier's department, nor has any staff in the Premier's office, including and very importantly, his Chief of Staff, nor in fact has she given evidence. We don't have any phone records from the Police Minister, Lisa Neville. The Premier's answer, well, if they want them, if the inquiry wants them, they can ask. If you were to provide your outgoing calls, the clarification in relation to then the incoming calls to Mr Ashton's phone would be very clear.
So again, if a request were made, then of course, on our form, and I'll confirm for you right now, of course we would provide and be cooperative in any way we possibly could. In any way we possibly could.
For all the parties who haven't provided them to date?
If requests were made.
So why doesn't the Premier just provide them? If no one has anything to hide, if it truly was a creeping assumption over weeks and weeks and weeks about the decision to use private security in hotel quarantine, if no one has anything to hide about who called Graham Ashton in that 6-minute period, why not release all the phone records now without delay? Indeed, I asked the Premier that question. A question of access to telephone records, which would prove, according to the contention of Victoria Police and Graham Ashton, that an individual communicated in that 6-minute period to Graham Ashton that there was a decision, not a creeping assumption, that there was a decision in relation to hotel quarantine. Now, Graham Ashton's records are incomplete because he cannot access, without a federal warrant, not state warrant, federal warrant, the incoming call record. But I might state that Chris Eccles, your records, Lisa Neville's records, and indeed your Chief of Staff's phone records, none of those at all have been provided to this inquiry. And I would think that that would be a very important piece of evidence to any inquiry worth its salt. And there's more, so much more, including serious questions today about whether Victoria's Emergency Management Commissioner, Andrew Crisp, has breached his legal obligations under the Act that governs his employment, and whether he should be, by law, stood aside for failing to brief the Police Minister during the 2 fateful days, 27 and 28 of March, when this whole hotel quarantine was set up. Right now, tonight, what is clear is this: that Victoria's hotel quarantine inquiry does not have the powers the Premier claims it has. That it does not have the powers to get to the truth of who made the call to Graham Ashton, advising him of the decision not to use police and military, but instead to use private security to guard Victoria's quarantine hotels. It does not have the powers to generally access phone records. They are federal powers, not state powers, not in the terms of reference of this inquiry, and not under Victoria's Inquiries Act. I say that, and in their submission today, Victoria Police say that. That critically, the Premier's private office is now implicated in texts in VicPol's own submission that must be pursued and must be provided publicly and transparently, that the redactions are lifted, because these text messages from the Premier's private office to his department occurred in this critical 6-minute window. And most importantly of all, that the Coates inquiry must now recall the Premier, Jenny Mikakos, Graham Ashton, Andrew Crisp, and call for the first time the Premier's Chief of Staff. If there's any bloody justice for the 800 dead Victorians as a result of this second wave outbreak that rests on this government's head, to do anything else would be a travesty. It would be a whitewash. And I say again, I am not going to let this go. I will not go away. And if I have to go to the Premier's press conference every day, I will, to get the answers and get to the bottom of this debacle. I will get the truth.